was quite involved in quite a lot of charity work as a sort of young teenager, which put me in contact with people who were underprivileged, who were predominantly Black. So I think from an early age, starting to see the sort of racial disparity. But actually, the biggest moment was I spent a year in the USA as an exchange student in 1983. And I landed up in Ithaca, New York, which is a university town. And so I was exposed to a lot of radical thinking, a big sort of disinvestment movement, an anti-apartheid movement. And yeah, so sort of a lot of people who were pretty antagonistic to me as a South African, as a white South African, and to obviously to South Africa. And so that was quite confrontational, and I had to really think and listen to what people were saying and think about what was going on in my country and listen to different perspectives. And I actually, one of the host brother of one of the families I was living with was like a young radical, as I think a lot of young people can be or are. And he was like really provocative and saying that I couldn't come back to South Africa and live in South Africa because just living in South Africa would be being complicit with the apartheid state. So that's quite a bold idea to have to confront. And of course I was going to come home, but it really made me think about what I was coming home to and what I would do when I came home. And so I literally got home and I'd registered at Wits University, and I walked straight up to the projects committee table, which is the National Union NUSAS's sort of recruiting ground. And I sort of said, well, where do I sign up? And so actually my whole university career I had this sort of, I guess, 2-track experience of being a university student. I was studying fine art, and by day, and by night I was being a student activist. Yeah, so that's how I spent the 80s.
All right, thank you so much. When you got involved, when you signed up with NUSAS, what was the stance that they were taking at the time? Why NUSAS?
Well, so NUSAS was I think I had subscribed while I was an exchange student. I'd subscribed to the Star newspaper used to produce a weekly international edition, and I'd subscribed to it because I wanted to stay in touch with what was going on at home. And I remember reading actually an article about the launch of the UDF, and I cut out this little this clipping from the newspaper because I thought it seemed like a really significant moment. And I had friends that had gone to university in the year that I was away, and so we were copying notes and stuff. And I think I probably asked somebody like, what do I do or how do I get involved? And they were like, well, NUSAS is the place to go. And it had a very strong anti-apartheid message. So it was really about encouraging students to be aware and to understand what was going on in the country and try to bring an end to it. So I guess it felt like home because it's kind of what I had been exposed to when I was away for the year. It was like actually just getting a different perspective, getting some facts about what was going on. So we would organize seminars and workshops on campus. We ran, like I'm now having to dig into my memory. We ran sort of media campaigns. We would put out information, and in fact, I guess I learned a lot about in sort of communicating, which has sort of helped me in my later life, but around informing and educating people. I think we had this, it's just coming back to me, this idea called PMO, which was politicize, mobilize, and organize. So it was a sort of theory around really about awakening people, getting them to be conscious about what was going on, mobilize them into action, and then organize to do something about it. And that's, so we organized, mass meetings, protests.
Could you perhaps tell us what was happening in the community that you were growing up at the time, or what were these laws that were in place that segregated people? Just paint a picture of what you saw to be unfolding during that time.
So we all lived in segregated areas. White people could only white people could live in white areas. And everybody else who was declared not white had to live in other designated areas. People who are not white, Black people, had to carry passes, which gave them permission to, or not, to move in white areas. So there were also very few Black students on our campus at the time. So the white campuses were predominantly white campuses. So everything was segregated. Shopping centers were dominated, inhabited by white people. If there were Black people in the environment that we were living in, they were in a lower class role, or they were in a subservient role. They were the servers and the cleaners. It's quite hard to actually think back, in the country that we live in now. It's so remarkably different to what it was when we grew up. It's pretty amazing that. So what roles did I fill? So I gosh, I don't know. I guess for a long time I was just an activist and wrote pamphlets and made posters and got up early in the morning and went and plastered them on campus or plastered them around town. But I did work for the student newspaper. So there was a period when I was the editor of the student newspaper. I also stood for the SRC, and I was on the SRC. And then actually I spent 2 years working for NewsAS as in the head office. The first year I was a national organizer, so I spent quite a lot of time on the road, traveling around to the campuses, working with other activists on campuses and organizing people. And then I was NewsAS president in 1990, which actually, in a way was a very important milestone year. The year started with the ANC being unbanned and Nelson Mandela being released. So actually the environment of the 80s, which was very traumatic, the late 80s, we were existing through states of emergencies. So the 1990s then it was the sort of breakthrough period when suddenly the ground beneath us actually shifted, and what we had been fighting for and demanding and asking for suddenly had emerged. But actually the environment got even more dangerous and difficult, even though the ANC was unbanned and Mandela was released and all the political prisoners.
Erica, who were some of your sort of role models and leaders during your time with NewsAS?
So the leadership of NewsAS, I came onto when I came onto campus, Kate Phillips was the NUSAS president, so there was a woman president. I think she was a really important role model. There were a lot of really powerful women in leadership positions, and so I think there wasn't a question about whether, if you're a woman, you could be a leader, because the environment was actually conducive to that. I think I was fortunate in that there were strong African leaders on campus. So the Black Student Society, which was very strong. And it, we didn't always have an easy relationship, because there was a lot of, of trust that needed to be developed between us. But some really powerful people that I learned a lot from. So I got a lot of, I guess, acquired knowledge through conversations and listening to debates from people, but I really wasn't a strong reader, I have to admit now.
Thank you. And what was NUSAS up against back then? I mean, were you allowed to, as NUSAS, could you get away with certain things that maybe the Black student movements couldn't? Can you maybe explain that a bit?
So I think it's an interesting question, because I think that we felt often that we had, to some extent, the benefit of privilege and the whiteness of our skins enabled us to do quite a lot. So I think that's why, the sort of protests and demonstrations on the campuses were quite important, because we could articulate a lot more before the police would come into campus. So I think we did play an important role in sort of, I guess, putting out kind of messages more widely. And I think because they were coming from the campuses, they were more likely to be written about. So I think we sort of called it exploiting the contradiction. So we really used that contradiction of the space that the universities allowed for us, and that's the police were a lot, or the force, the armed forces, there were a lot less, they were more reticent to use the same levels of violence against us as they would on the historically Black university campuses.
Erica, when you were elected as the president of NUSAS was it 1990, you said?
Yeah.
How did that come about? Why you?
I don't know. I mean, I was a really committed activist. I think we all were. I often, if I reflect back on my period as a student, I think that I was predominantly an activist and secondly a student. So it kind of almost had become our lives, or my life. It was very scary. It was terrifying. The environment was scary. So there was this element of putting yourself in personal danger, although again, I don't think that we were a particular danger as white students, but there was that possibility. So it wasn't something that I grasped, with two hands and said, I'm going to do this.
All right, thank you. And one other question is, do you have a message for our youth, for youth activists, for women, young women of the country who are activists?
I think that what we learned as student activists, and not just student activists, as activists in the 80s and probably before, is that change is possible. And I think it's important to remember that, because as you know, like as difficult as the moment is, or as the times are, or as trying to think of the right words, as established or as set as the system seems to be, actually change is possible. And I think that's what we all experienced, all those of us that were there in the 1980s and 90s, is that you can actually, you know, with unity and with action and with purpose and with clarity around what the challenges are, and the root of the challenges, you can actually bring about change.